Assalamu alaikum and welcome to IPRI's podcast. Today, we're joined with Brigadier Rashid Wali Janjua, Director Research at IPRI, and Mr. Siddiq Humayun, Director Advocacy and Communications at IPRI. The United Nations has proclaimed 21st August as the International Day of Remembrance of and Tribute to the Victims of Terrorism. Today, we are going to have a conversation to discuss the importance of this day globally and its relevance to Pakistan. Brigadier Rashid, we start with you. Can you elaborate on the prevailing security landscape in Pakistan and with a particular focus on combating terrorism and especially how it's evolved post 2014 when the attack on the Army Public School happened?
See, terrorism is a phenomena with which Pakistan has been grappling since long, and there's no country more impacted by this insidious phenomena than Pakistan. And it has been excoriated by India for acts of terrorism, and they have very cleverly conflated the struggle for independence of Kashmiris with this phenomenon, whereas the fact is that the whole ecosystem of terrorism in South Asia and in Pakistan that has a clear imprimatur of India. You see, it is a phenomena that can be defined as a propaganda by deed. The terrorist resorts to violence to create impact and win over the more adherents to their cause, or to sow a climate of fear, to browbeat the population to achieve their political end. So that's a simple definition. So Pakistan has been experiencing with metronomic regularity, especially post 1979. And there were reasons for that, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the whole ecosystem of struggle, violent struggle was created. Then the jihadi element came into that, and there were forces inimical to the interests of the country, which diverted this whole issue towards violence, which had nothing to do with any ideology, just to accrue the rents. So a ragtag polyglot assemblage of petty thugs, they banded together, they became the power brokers and started accruing rent, and there were external patrons for those. And we then go back to our post 1979 scenario, where the whole nurseries, they were hashed, so to speak. The whole social fabric of our tribal areas was transformed, and a new kind of a socio-political construct emerged. So that was a happy hunting ground for the forces which could use that environment for their terrorist purposes. And after that, we go to war on terror by the Americans. So another environment was engendered, which was in response to American presence in Afghanistan and the struggle for national liberation, which Americans termed as terrorism and which the Taliban termed as a struggle for national liberation. And because of the linkages with our tribal areas, now they are called merged districts, we also suffered the spillover impacts. And there were sanctuaries, there were bases both across the border. And Pakistan, despite being a bulwark against terrorism, and despite the best cooperation offered, despite completely fulfilling the commitments as per the UN Resolution 1373, was treated as a favorite whipping boy for ulterior motives. And this terrorist upsurge, it got its apogee in 2014 when our APS at Peshawar was attacked. So that was an act of bestiality. and you could hear the people who actually came to attack. They were taking directions from Afghanistan, and those directions were that, look, are these children young enough to be spared? And their handlers told them, no, they are old enough to be killed. So this was a complete bestiality based upon violence and based upon uh, terror, which had nothing to do with any ideology. And that was the time, that was the watershed moment, the entire nation woke up. And the people started accepting it as a clear and present danger. There were many fence sitters, there were many denialists, and there were many apologists till then. And soon the entire environment changed. People understood, and the nation got galvanized. And after that, the military courts were also instituted, the punishments and the whole system of conviction that was set into place. NACTA was energized. So the nation's resolve was evident, and Pakistan has been fighting terror through campaigns, operations, a whole slew of operations like Rai Rast, Rahe Nijat, Zarbe Azm, Raddul Fasad. Those were conducted at heavy human and material cost to stamp out the last vestiges of this terrorism. But this is such a multidimensional phenomena. It has social reasons, social factors that sustain it and nurture it. So it needs a whole of the nation and whole of the society response.
Sir, when you talk about terrorism and people also, when the terrorists came to and they were taking directions from others, how does cross-border terrorism in that situation and terrorists, the relationship with other countries and that particular situation impact Pakistan's internal security and its relationship with its own neighbors and its alignment or unalignment with those neighbors then?
You see, terrorism flourishes in ungoverned spaces. The conditions which are most propitious for terrorists to flourish are those where there is a lack of rule of law, and they find that easy habitat to train and make their bases. Afghanistan was one such place. They were soon after war on terror, when the Americans left, there was in 2012 onwards, the Afghanistan was in a virtual contested space where Americans were trying their best to establish an order, but the overall country was in disorder. The resistance had its own inexorable march, and it kept on. The momentum was not stopped by the Americans, and ultimately they had to leave by 2021. Once they left, it was a precipitous withdrawal, and that withdrawal did not ensure an orderly transition. The Taliban, they took over, and those who had fought with them as their colleagues, whether Americans like TTP, who were actually operating in Pakistan. So TTP depredations got a sudden fillip soon after American withdrawal. And ever since then, there has been a steady spike because there are bases inside Afghanistan, Kunard, Paktia, Paktita, Host, we all know it. Positive engagement with the Afghan interim government has yielded mixed results, but overall they have not been able to stop the cross-border movement of TTP elements. So the habitat of terrorism, we need to understand, it always gets strength from absence of rule of law or lax implementation of law. And Afghanistan is one such place at this point, though the Taliban, they claim that they have a complete control, but we know there are elements like ISKP, Al-Qaeda, which are also using the Afghan soil for their own terrorist acts. And even ISKP has become a menace for Russia and Central Asian states as well. So this situation is a very complicated mosaic of terrorism inside Afghanistan, and the Afghan interim government has not been able to rein in those elements. So that creates problems for Pakistan, and Pakistan is beset with a very serious challenge of TTP here. And we must also remember that once these terrorist entities, they band together with non-secular, secular variety also, those which have ethno-nationalistic grievances. BLF separatists, which are operating in our coastal belt and Balochistan, ostensible aim is to destabilize Pakistan and its CPAC infrastructural route. And those ports which are coming up as our commercial hope in future, like Gwadar. So that is the target. And unfortunately, there are external forces which are inimical to Pakistan, and they are fishing in troubled waters, and they are supporting such entities. And now there are clear pointers that TTP and BLA, they at operational level, they combine their operations, they coordinate their activities, and there has been some information about their close collaboration. And in fact, some of the captured terrorists have yielded this information.
Great. And sir, sir has already spoken about India's possible role in terrorism, and Sir Siddique Humayun, we're going to move on to you. So, how has India been involved in terrorism in the Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir, and what specific instances and patterns of violence indicate a state policy of terrorism that we see in Kashmir now?
I'd like to start with quotation from a book that I read last year, No Friends But Mountains by Judith Matloff, and she starts the chapter on Kashmir with a quotation that Kashmir showed me how prolonged violence and fear can destroy the soul. So it's systematic, it's violent, and it's been going on for 8 decades, nearly 8 decades. There are multiple reports that there is sexual violence, there is systematic violence, and you see those examples that over 11,000 women have been raped. That is systematic violence. There's a sustained fear in the population, especially in the mothers in Kashmir, in the Indian illegally occupied Kashmir, that somebody is going to knock on their door at night at a random time. They're going to take their son away. So it's a state-sponsored terrorism, and we see that this story of violence has continued for, as I said, for nearly 8 decades. International community has a responsibility, and I think it is on them to help put a stop to it. But we see it around the world. If you're the blue-eyed boy, you can get away even with genocide.
Yeah, and when we're talking about around the world, we have to talk about the Israel-Palestine conflict. So what, in your opinion, are the repercussions for international peace and security of the international community not doing anything about what Israel is doing in Palestine? Because a lot of authors, and even from an international law lens, people are coming up and saying that what Israel is doing is amounting to state terrorism on some level. So
I think what Israel is doing is obviously terrorism, and it's actually a step further than terrorism. It's a genocide. You're practically killing a population based on who they are. Terrorism is still, in a sense, not on a larger scale like a genocide. So genocide is even worse. And when you talk about terrorism specifically, we see that the first terrorist organization to actually use terror as a means of action was Haganah. That was a Jewish paramilitary organization that worked in Palestine in the 1920s and 30s, before even Israel was born. So they have this tendency of using terror and violence as a means of getting their agenda through. And we see that again in the first Nakba. when the Palestinians were kicked out of their homeland, the Israeli settlers took over. And we've seen it over many years since 1948. If you just go back 15 years, you see multiple operations that Israel conducts against Gaza or the West Bank. Basically, Gaza rebuilds itself, Israel comes and demolishes it again. That is a state-sponsored terrorism. Just 2 days ago, they bombed a school and massacred over 100 children. I think if you can't call that terrorism, I don't know what else that is. And even states on an international level have called it genocide. Even international organizations are calling it genocide. And I think genocide and terrorism go hand in hand, because if you're perpetrating genocide, you're using terrorism as a response to it. And it just shows the failure of international community as a whole to put an end to it.
And so, and when we talk about those who are affected from terrorism, and Brigadier Junjave, I'm going to move on, come back to you on this. So, there, even in Pakistan, the affectees of terrorism are manyfold. So, from your point of view and from your experience, what are the primary challenges that are faced by victims of terrorism, which could include social, legal, economic challenges, and even their integration back into society? Both those who are the victims of terrorism and those who have also been impacted by it on a peripheral level.
You see, terrorism is such a destructive phenomena that it saps the elan vital of a nation, socially also, culturally also. It's just like a structural violence that is visited upon a society.
Economically as well.
Economically also, and it impacts the psyche. You see our merged districts now, despite the best efforts of the government to integrate those areas into the settled areas, there are still problems because a whole social order was disrupted, and the new social order has not been consolidated as yet. There is a governance vacuum, there is a social structural vacuum. The old Maliks, the tribals, elders that used to hold the society together, the revived, the Pashtunwali code that acted as a gel, which gelled the society together. It gave way to a different, culture. That culture was of power brokers, those who came and they tried to establish their writ by the gun. And once they were pushed back and sanitized from those areas, this resulting vacuum is still creating problems. Now there are land disputes in those areas, and people are coming back to their homes, and they find their homes and their lands. They are still not in that state to start and resume their normal activities. There are psychological scars. Women have lost husbands, and they've lost their children. The children who have been tormented, and they have seen this psychological trauma. It is impacting society in a manner that it is facing a lot of difficulty in integrating. Now we can put the numbers on that. Some people say that over 80,000 lives have been lost. Some people say that 120 billion US dollars worth of loss has been incurred, but those just pale into insignificance compared to the mental psychosocial traumas that the society has gone through. And same was the case with the areas which are insurgency ridden in Balochistan. The insurgents they attack, there's a climate of fear, people can't go and children can't go to school.
Yeah, it's generational trauma for
exactly.
those kids now.
So that I think exacts a heavy toll on society, and it is the responsibility of then the whole nation and society to encourage those impacted segments to come back to normalcy. It's a slow and shadowless incremental process which requires development, which requires a law and order, and which also requires society's help by way of creating those cushions against the resurgence of such activities and acts. For example, there were certain drivers of terrorism, and people point their finger at lack of development, of lack of livelihood opportunities, and the opportunists and the criminal elements who use Islamic ideology as a fig leaf and say that we are going to impose Sharia so that people can't question their motives. And their real motive is to browbeat and hold the spaces and create a kind of control from where they can resort to their criminal activities and accrue the rents. So the nation has to be very resolute to fight this hydra-headed phenomena.
And so, Humayun, building on that, from an international lens, what do you think are some particular challenges to victims of terrorism in Kashmir and Palestine as we see right now happening in the world? And particularly, you spoke about how Kashmir has seen a lot of women being targeted. So, do you feel like there's a gendered element to terrorism, and that is a particular separate issue of gender-based violence that is being perpetuated through terrorism?
Yes, and I think it's evident that obviously, as Brigadier Rashid just said as well, that it's a trauma that's inflicted on a society as a whole. However, in certain cases, it's more for women because women see that they go through incidents like rape and sexual abuse, and that can, leave a lingering and lasting impact on their lives for many years to come. And we see this in international terrorist organizations where we've seen it in Boko Haram in Nigeria when they kidnapped schoolgirls. We've seen what ISIS has done in Iraq with the Yazidi women. And all of that has caused a trauma and a sense of helplessness among the women. And then, generally speaking, again, this is not a I can't put a number to it, but generally speaking, men are killed more in terrorist attacks compared to women. But that leaves women helpless and alone to fight on themselves. So they have to figure out how to run their house. They have to figure out how to go out without their brothers, without their fathers, without their husbands. So that has an impact on the life of a woman as well. And especially as, again, as Brigadier Rashid Saab said, that when certain ideologies try to impose their own version of Sharia law, women also suffer more compared to men because, as you see in Afghanistan and you've seen in many other places where Sharia practically means that women need to be bound to their homes. They cannot get educated, they cannot go out and work, and that is not really, the essence of Islam. But as being I wouldn't say as a weaker sex, but as a part of population that still needs a lot of empowerment. Terrorism affects women much more and in a much more psychological way than it does men. And we see it in places like Pakistan and Afghanistan and Indian occupied Kashmir, even in Africa and Palestine. When a whole family is killed or they're taken away, especially men of that family, it's women and children who are left. In case of Gaza right now, even that's been, that cannot be the case because they're killing women and children as well, so they're kind of decimating the whole country. But generally speaking, women tend to have this psychological impact that affects them more than men. And there is a gender-based violence issue when it comes to terrorism, when organizations like Boko Haram and even terror organizations operating within Pakistan and Afghanistan, when they try to, force their way on women, and it ends up having sexual violence, rape, taking away their children, and then in other cases, when their men are affected, then those women have to end up doing everything themselves. So that in itself is a problem as well. So this is a long-term issue for women. Whereas for men, it is obviously bad. I'm not saying that they have it easy. They have it hard as well. But for women,
it is... But widows of Kashmir is now a phenomenon.
There are more than 22,000 widows in Kashmir.
Terrorism is such an insidious phenomenon that if you parse open its anatomy, you should know that it needs a catalyst, it needs a cause, it needs a champion. And it has been beautifully put across in a book, Starfish and the Spider. The spider has a central nervous system and it operates centrally according to a cause, and there is a champion. But starfish has distributed network. It has a ideology, and even if you cut one piece, another will regenerate. So that is in the nature of terrorism. The cause, the motive, and the champions, they are so intermixed that it's a fascinating story if you relate it to how people resisted terrorism and how human resilience overcame this insidious phenomena. For example, in our merged districts, there was a study carried out by Islamabad Policy Research Institute, and the empirical findings were startling. It was found out that most of the recruits to this terrorist cause, they were under 30, and 66% they were under 25. Over 70% they were not educated or partially educated, and only 10% had a criminal record, which meant that those poor cannon fodder type of stuff which was being used for the terrorists, and they could win them over by offering a pittance. Why? Because there was no livelihood, there was no opportunity, there was no state presence that could offer them an alternative. And once the society is given these alternatives, the society itself stands up and resists the ingress of terrorism. And that is also a very reassuring example from our own counter-terrorism efforts in Pakistan's level. And in Kashmir, you see, since 1989, over 90,000 deaths have taken place. Over 11,000 rapes have been reported. Draconian laws like Public Safety Act, Armed Forces Special Powers Act, 213 weeks of internet apartheid, then the denial of education, denial of political rights, incarcerations. So that all terror echo system could not break the will of Kashmiris. And the Indians are still compelled to keep a presence of 1 million troops there just to keep the Kashmiris under control. Despite annexation of Kashmir, the will of Kashmiris is still alive, and they have borne the maximum brunt of terrorism at the hands of Indians. Whereas if you listen to Jai Shankar, the Indian Foreign Minister, is very fond of externalizing and imputing the blame to countries which are actually impacted by terrorism, like Pakistan. So these are the realities, and we live in a difficult neighborhood, but the hope lies in the resilience of humanity.
And I'd like to add just a very small bit that because it's the day on the remembrance of the victims of terrorism, so I think we should also remember people like Burhan Wani, who was killed by Indian forces in Kashmir, school-going kid Etazaz Hassan in Hangu, who hugged a suicide bomber and saved the lives of many of his school fellows while putting his own life in danger, and actually he got martyred. And many other, including Benazir Bhutto and so many other people who have lost their lives to this scourge of terrorism.
And 160 law enforcement personnel who have laid down their lives since January 24 to date.
To date.
So this nation owes a very heavy debt of gratitude to them.
And sir, the global conversation right now is also surrounding the fact that international organizations such as the UN are coming forth and are repeatedly wanting to play a bigger role in both helping states combat terrorism and also supporting victims of terrorism. And just like quickly, like a minute each from you, on what role do you both think that what space is there for international organizations to play their part in, say, for a country like Pakistan to do both, to help combat terrorism, but also help support those who have gone through this unspeakable, horrendous.
I think the first thing international community needs to do is to call a spade and remove this asphyxiating ambivalence about the definition of the terrorism. So terrorism, if you don't have a definition which is internationally consensually accepted, then there would be a fractured international response, and therein lies the problem. So India as a country which resorts to terrorism, accuses other countries of terrorism, and same goes with the rest of the world. So there has to be a standardized, internationally and UN accepted definition, and then international community has the
definitely.
So they need to.
We don't have an international treaty on banning terrorism because there is no definition on terrorism.
We cannot get on the same table in figuring out what exactly terrorism is. The whole world is calling Israel a terrorist, but the US vetoes any legislation put in the Security Council. We see what happens in India, in occupied Kashmir, in Africa, in many countries. We had in 1994 the Rwandan genocide. I keep repeating this example many times, but we see that the whole genocide happened and nobody did anything until it was practically ended. A million people were killed in 3 months. And the same thing is happening in many other places, including Gaza right now. But the international community seems to be helpless. And that is, I think, one of the reasons, besides the definition, is that the international community as a whole does not have a mechanism to implement its decisions either. So they're not really binding on states because every state considers itself sovereign. When it comes to what they're doing, they think that what they're doing is right and nobody else has any right to stop.
There's a counter-terrorism committee in the UN Security Council, and there is a sanctions monitoring committee. They are doing their bit, but like I said, that unless you have a very clear definition, the whole response will remain fractured.
Thank you for watching our podcast. So, terrorism, as 21st August is now the designated day, makes us more conscious of the fact that it is high time the international community comes together to at least come on board with a working definition of terrorism, and then move towards an international treaty that recognizes it as such, and so we have it all laid out for states to move forward in that direction. Thank you so much for joining us for our podcast, and we look forward to seeing you in future AP podcasts. Thank you.